So hello and a very warm welcome to Anne Richards. Anne and I have known each other for many years, and I'm absolutely delighted that she's able to join us for the fireside chat today. Thank you, Anne. As Jamie said in his closing of his previous panel, Anne is the Chief Executive of Fidelity International. She took up that post in December 2018 from M&G, but she's actually worked with an illustrious set of companies over the years, and she has had the most remarkable career. Anne is a role model, a thought leader, and has profound common sense views. And I'm absolutely delighted, Anne, that you're joining us today. One thing you may not know, everybody who's listening in, is that Anne actually is an extraordinary polymath. She is a scientist, she's a chartered engineer, and she started her career at CERN. So when Anne starts to think about a challenge as big as climate or societal issues, she really does start from first principles. Now, and obviously yesterday we heard from the Chancellor here in the UK that we're facing one of the most significant recessions that we've seen since the Great Frost of 1709, another event that the world threw at us as a race that we didn't expect. But I'd like to just put that just to one side for a minute and maybe go back to one of his earlier and more hopeful interventions in the Green Horizon Summit, which was about the steps he's taking to really stimulate the green and sustainable finance market in the UK. So I wonder whether you could give us your thoughts and reflections on what you heard, whether it was about mandatory TCFD reporting, contributing to international standards, or some of the other work that he was talking about.
Elizabeth, thank you. And I feel I'm doomed to disappoint. You've given me such a wonderful introduction, and
You never disappoint.
So I kind of feel the bar has been set high. So, but thank you for your very kind words. Look, what an incredibly fascinating year this has been. And you talked about going back to first principles. When I've been asked, what is it that we've learned from this year? This year we have learned that sometimes the unthinkable really happens. And sometimes the ability to be really radical in our response to the unthinkable, that our capacity to do the things which we couldn't even imagine were possible are actually much more within our reach than we think. And so I think that is the thought to start with in terms of holding on to what the UK is really trying to reach for. And the Green Horizon Summit was a great reflection on that, not just the Chancellor's comments, but just the whole concept of what the summit was trying to get at. I think huge thanks to everybody that sort of really made that happen. I think what the Chancellor laid out is the ambition to really show we can go further and faster than we imagine. And disclosure, the TCFD disclosure ambition is one part of that. I think by making it explicit what we are reaching for, it will change behavior. It will unquestionably change behavior. And the terrific thing about markets are they're wonderful forward-looking mechanisms. They are discounting mechanisms. And you see that sometimes. That's why bubbles get created, because people see the huge potential in something and sometimes get overexcited about it. But that, I think, is what we need to hold on to. The Chancellor has laid out that ambition. Disclosure is a really important part of it. For us as a business, actually, we're Fidelity International. We're a private company. We're owned by employees and by the family. But we've said ourselves that we are going to publish our own TCFD report by the end of this year, really to kind of try and show the way. It's not easy. We really know it's not easy, but to try and show the way on that forward-looking basis that this is something that we should all aspire to and reach towards. So I think it is immensely positive, Elizabeth. I think it's a great first step for us.
And how do you think we can hang on to that sense of can-do attitude and thinking out of the box that you just described? Because I think this ability for companies to take a lead, such as you're doing at Fidelity International, I think is so important. How do we keep that sort of ambition level going?
We've all learned as organizations, we've all learned an enormous amount this year, and that sort of power of being able to pull things together. And we have precedents through history which have shown us that when the ambition is clear, when the vision is clear and not overly prescriptive, we've tended to be able to do great things. That's how we ended up with the benefit, with the welfare system. in the earlier part of the 20th century. It's how we ended up with universal healthcare in the UK, which is still something that is truly marvelous. And we've all depended on this year. And I think we're at one of those moments, and it's kind of that mix of, as leaders in the corporate sector or in the government sector, understanding that setting that vision and being committed to that vision, but then kind of getting out the way of that bottom-up agility and innovation which happens. It's trying to get that combination of capturing the bottom up and giving the clarity on the top down. And if you can get those two things together, then you start to be able to build something that is sustainable.
I totally agree, and I think that is absolutely right. One of the challenges I look at is we heard Mark Carney talk about long-term. You yourself have talked about the need for long-term sustainable investing strategy, and you were an investor. You actually made investment decisions as well as being CEO. And yet we have a market system which is relentlessly based on sort of being fed quarterly data, quarterly earnings, analyst outlooks. How do we break that vicious cycle, do you think? Can we break it?
Well, look, I think we have moved somewhat away from that. I mean, when I think of what I think of as the nadir on that, which probably is going back, let's say sort of 10-ish years ago. I think there was a realization that we were in a vicious cycle now of management and board behavior being driven by very short-term behavior, which was then putting investors to focus on that short. So everybody was just on the cycle in the wrong way. And I think we've stepped back. We've moved a little bit back from quarterly reporting, which I think is an excellent thing. We have seen incentives, financial incentives, stretch further out, getting longer and longer term. Maybe even in the financial sector post-crisis, thinking about things like clawback, for example. So really stretching those horizons out. And I think there is an element of understanding that it is right that markets do punish certain behaviors, certain results in the short term, because, as I said, they're discounting mechanisms. But that as company management, sometimes what you have to be willing to do is to take a stand on something and to push through it. And I think on the sustainability agenda, what we have learned from the way indeed whole industries, not just companies, have evolved this year, is that sustainability agenda ultimately leads to better financial performance. I mean, the data is, I think, reasonably compelling on that front. So the way that we tend to think about it internally, one of the things that has fascinated me is, on this sort of cycle of short-termism, is the fact that company longevity has been shrinking. So if you go back to the mid 1950s, for example, versus today, company longevity has collapsed in comparison. Even if you go back to the FTSE 100, when it was launched in 1984, I think it was, there's only 30 of those original 100 companies are still around. So companies don't survive. Majority of companies actually, they get taken over, or they fail, or they get absorbed into something else. They don't actually succeed in the long term. And that should be something which is really a focus for boards. So to be survived, what is it you need to survive as a business? You need sustainable profitability, and you need a resilient business model. And resilience is about thinking about the risks and how you mitigate those risks and how you have a contingency plan for dealing with those risks. So I think what we've seen through this year is a short-term focus on financial performance is much more likely to lead to a non-resilient business model. Therefore, it's in everybody's financial interests, ultimately, to think about resilience, to think about sustainability, because both of those things link to survivability, which is also closely linked and correlated with long-term financial performance. So I think that is how you pull all of that together. But, I think it's also just really important to stress good financial discipline and strong financial performance are necessary. They are important. They're just not the only important things. And it's trying to get that balance right that I think boards and company management really need to think about.
Yeah. And I mean, as you know, I sit as a non-exec on a couple of companies, and that's certainly true. I think the challenge is that, as you say, companies don't survive for long. You have executive tenure is not that long. And also the remarkable thing is that investment managers that are hired by pension funds who have sort of 20, 30 or enduring year liabilities, the period of that hire is also reducing. So I can remember when I started in the industry, you'd have a relationship with an institutional client that could be 10, 15 years old. but we've seen that that's reducing as well. So surely that puts performance pressure on the manager that gets shorter term as well. How do you balance that?
Well, this is a conundrum, and of course John Kay did a wonderful report on this a few years ago, thinking about short-termism. I think it's, as fund managers, I think when you are looking after other people's assets, there's a couple of different things to bear in mind. The first is, the more honest you can be upfront about what are the conditions in which you will outperform and what are the conditions in which you will underperform, the easier it is to help, whether it's trustees, whether it's individual investors, but to help people go through a period of underperformance. And this year has been several years recently have been quite interesting. If you're a value investor, for example, there are some really good value investors who have underperformed, at least until relatively recently, a broader index. If people own the shares or own the fund or have hired the manager specifically because they want to keep that value lens, then actually my experience has tended to be that when that's clear up front and everybody is aligned, you get an awful lot more willingness to work with you through periods of underperformance. I think when it's difficult is when there's not that clarity in advance, that then it gets really quite hard for somebody to assess, is your fund manager just not very good? Or is it because there's, for example, a style factor in there? So, I think we all sit on both sides of this. Probably a lot of people on this call sit on both sides of this conundrum. So, but I think that clarity up front and that honesty up front really helps the more difficult periods, because even the best fund manager in the world will underperform at different moments in time. It's because that's the nature of markets.
Absolutely right. And I think that takes us into the whole question of transparency, honesty, of communication, which I think is absolutely at the centre of this, whether it's between the investor and the asset owner, or whether it's between the investor and the companies in which they're invested or are lending to. You made a very important point about markets being superb discounting mechanisms, and they are. I mean, that's essentially what it does. And of course, that requires data. And it requires data that enables the market to start being forward-leaning and starting to discount. We have spent decades trying to refine financial data through IFRS and local GAAP to be something that is at least a reasonably level playing field, although people will tell me it's not, but it's reasonably level playing field. But where are we on sustainability data? I mean, how can markets start to discount on issues, really important sustainable issues, if the data isn't there?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's some data there. We should say that. It's already dramatically better today than it was going back 5 years. But a lot of the data isn't consistent. A lot of the data is qualitative rather than quantitative. And again, I know from our own business, when we're sort of trying to, we operate in more than 25 different countries, and we're sort of trying to figure out some of the things in our own business. I mean, I know it is not straightsforward. I think at one count, there were more than 600 different flavors of taxonomies and frameworks around various different supersets and subsets of the ESG matrix. So I think that the work that the IBC, the World Economic Forum, and various others, I think all the big accountancy firms have been involved in trying to think about how you establish a unifying framework, a unifying set of principles that then ultimately can become something akin to the same global accounting standards that we have in the financial sector. We don't need perfection. We don't need every iota to be identical in all aspects, but to give companies a bit more clarity about their direction of travel and what they should be thinking at. I think we will get there, by the way. I mean, when it was first proposed that there should be global accounting standards, that was regarded as heretical at the time. And we've clearly made an enormous way forward. So I think we will, over the next 3 years, very much move in this direction. But my advice to company management, and I do get asked this quite a lot, is don't wait for perfection. And if you're struggling to figure out which taxonomy to use or which framework to start producing stuff against, don't agonize too much. Pick something sensible and do your best to openly and honestly report against it. And actually, you know, as investors, we understand, because we're analyzing against all of these different frameworks ourselves. We know that there's this whole, as we talk about it, this sort of spaghetti soup, the alphabet soup, that we're all wrestling with. So I think the direction of travel is now much better. I think trying to pull all these frameworks together will make our lives a little bit more straightforward. But don't get hung up about waiting for that. Just get on and do something. Certainly, when we launched a couple of years ago, we launched our own rating system. So every single company in our universe, whether it's held within a fixed income portfolio or an equity portfolio, we rate on our own rating systems. And we deliberately made that forward-looking, because at the end of the day, we will create a change for the planet is if we can get the delta right. It's the change from where we are today. And we're less worried about the absolute description of where a company is today on a whole range of characteristics. We're much more interested about how they can do the improvement from today to where they're going to get to next year and the year after and the year after. And I think that's how we get the momentum, and that's how we get the direction of travel. So, you know, as I say, I don't agonize about it. It is a big, tough conundrum. But we're starting to see all the right people get involved in creating something that will start to be a sensible set of principles and ultimately a sensible set of standards. And if companies just get on and do their best, you know, then I think we will make progress. And I think progress is what we're reaching for.
And that, if I can say, that is a typically pragmatic and sensible answer, which is typical of you. I would say, though, that I was talking to somebody recently who receives questionnaires from asset managers of a large FTSE company, and they get between 70 and 80 different questionnaires in the run up to every AGM, as well as all the proxy agency guidance and everything else. So I think what you have there is a very pragmatic approach. When you're on the receiving end of it, I think in corporate world, you're getting a blizzard of demands, each driven by, I think, a sincere philosophy within the manager. Is there something the industry can do, the asset management industry can do, to accelerate this convergence? Because it's very much the Institute's belief that we do need global convergence, we do need standards, and we absolutely shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But when you're on the receiving end of it, and there's such a lot of power in that relationship with the investors, so what could you encourage your colleagues and fellow CEOs to do about that?
Well, I mean, certainly, you know, it is a topic of conversation. It's partly determined by what we are asked to do by our own clients, as we know, because, you know, and it was said in one of the earlier panels, actually, you know, we're guardians of other people's money. You know, I don't get to do whatever I like with the money that's entrusted to us. Lovely if I did, but we absolutely don't. So we have to be guided at one level by absolutely by what we're asked to do with that money. I think the convening power, and this is why the Green Horizons conference was so important. I think convening power matters. I think the CFA Institute, they're moving in this space. I think the Investment Association has done fantastic work, and obviously they've produced the most recent report this week on just thinking about that whole shareholder dynamic. And I think, you know, I think we are moving in that direction, and I think we need to keep the pressure moving towards a more coherent approach on this. But as I am an optimist on this, I think the direction of travel is right. And although, you know, for the company board that gets 70 different requests at an AGM, I think there are pretty practical and pragmatic ways that you can choose to respond to that, which doesn't necessarily meaning responding to each one individually, but how can you collate and then give a standardized response? And I think most sensible fund managers understand that. So I don't have a perfect answer on that, Elizabeth, but I think...
No, I think it's a good answer. And I'm also an optimist. And I think when you get a galvanizing issue, like diversity was an issue, now we have a much broader definition of inclusion, diversity into equality as well. You do actually start to see asset managers, asset owners and others coalescing around 2 or 3 key points. And I think it's very encouraging. I would just encourage everybody to do even more of it. But that takes us into another important point. And you mentioned John Kay's work, where I remember there was one sentence in it which I thought was, I didn't agree with it at the time, but I think was quite prophetic now, which is actually all equity owners really are is they're governance people with stewardship responsibilities towards capital. And at the time I thought, well, no, we're trying to create value for clients. But actually, with the whole evolution of what's called multi-stakeholder capitalism, this responsibility back to society and to all stakeholders, it's interesting, isn't it? Because that perspective is shifting to asset managers and asset owners being accountable for how they engage and what their stewardship responsibilities are. So where do you think this is going to take us, and how are we going to get there with a positive outcome as opposed to sort of boilerplate and box ticking?
Well, again, this is why I feel this year has caused a step change in the reflection of and understanding of what stakeholder capitalism actually means. So it's gone from being a kind of slightly fluffy, if I can say that, and not particularly precise kind of view of what and how it fitted with company law and lots of other things, into an understanding that so in a way, if you think about the financial versus non-financial aspects, that, and that's maybe a kind of a way of framing it, that there are many costs which are not necessarily captured in a financial P&L. And in an anti-stakeholder world, those costs might be borne by, it could be the community, it could be the environment, it could be other people, and it's not captured in the direct P&L measurement. Except in a year like this year, where you suddenly discover that companies actually have been trading off of potentially a broader public good. And when that public good falls away, then you start to see that they're very exposed. So I think that understanding that a company relies on some invisible public goods is one way of starting to frame what a company's responsibility is to those public goods, and therefore their stakeholders that are all related to it. So when you then think of what is your role as a guardian, I prefer the word guardian to steward, as a guardian of other people's money, and therefore, you know, as a guardian of their financial health, there's the avoiding, there's the delivery of financial return. And I think it is important, Elizabeth. I think you're right in what you said. I mean, that delivery of financial return is important, but that aiming to protect against the permanent loss of capital means you need to understand what might affect that permanent loss of capital. And that is sometimes where these externalities come in. So that's how I would pull them together. It's about helping companies, it's about helping boards think about where are the invisible things which are maybe just not financial yet, or maybe they're only financial in a certain set of circumstances. But boy, when we get a year like this, where we see our whole industries that are suddenly financially not the wonderful, viable, sustainable models that they thought they were, it really has focused minds. Now, this was an exceptional year, and I think we're all sitting here hoping that we don't have any, we don't have a repetition of a year like this year, but I think we must learn from it and extrapolate. And it brings us back to that climate conversation, which is thinking, well, you know, we saw what a pandemic could do. If the climate, if the environment isn't higher up our priority list, we could be facing a similar set of conditions as a result of that imperative. And just because it's a bit slower burn, to use quite a bad metaphor, doesn't mean that it couldn't be as significant or even more significant. So I think we have to learn from it.
Yeah, and actually that's a very good segue into picking up some great questions we're starting to get in here. Number one was about the fireside chat shouldn't be burning coal. And actually, Anne is one of the few people who has a fireplace behind her, and there is no coal in it, Nigel. So we're all good. We're not burning anything, not wood, not anything. So we're actually being very environmentally friendly in this chat. Don't worry, anybody. There's a much more serious and important question that's come in, though, from somebody who works at a mid-level in an investment management company and has really been struck by what you said about bottom up and top down. And they're focusing on the bottom up. And they basically say that in their organization, ESG is seen as a bit of a fad. And it trickles down into the organization in that way. Actually, how can they have an influence within that organization because they believe in it? What's your advice? And this is so important because one of the things the pandemic has done, it's created more equal contributions. It's really raised a sort of level playing field, but yet people still feel bound by old hierarchies in trying to influence change in their organizations.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. So there's a couple of different things. I mean, one of the things that we've used very actively this year has been Yammer, which is, it's basically like your internal Twitter network. Some people have Slack, various other things. That is a great, and one of the reasons I love it is because I get to see what people are talking about internally, what they're thinking about. So if you want to, so if you've got an internal network like that, use it to start a conversation. Now, and I say what I'm about to say, I say it with a tiny bit of hesitancy, because every organization is different, but you could try just emailing your CEO, because I get quite a lot of direct emails from people about things that they care about. And when I get one email, I think that's kind of interesting. When I get 5 emails, I think that's really interesting. We are a consumer-facing business at the end of the day. And I always say internally, we will never have happy customers if I don't have a happy team internally, because they're completely linked in my mind. So, and I think most chief executives understand that you really have to listen in any consumer-facing business to what your own staff are saying, because quite often they are also, or people very like them, your customers. So I would say start a conversation. And, and if you want to be a little bit subtle about it and you're not comfortable just directly emailing your CEO, find 1 or 2 senior executives who you do feel a bit of empathy with and have a quiet chat with them. Or, as I say, use your internal social media channels and maybe start a conversation, see if you can get a little bit of a sub-movement going with other like-minded colleagues. And you'll find eventually you get a bit of traction on that.
That's interesting. And I think that's talking about sort of change within an organization. We've got quite a few questions coming in around the more systemic change that's needed. You talked about data, you talked about this convergence towards a more sustainable reporting. There's a couple of questions around what should the asset management industry be doing to contribute to that? In actions, not words. What should we do?
Well, look, I mean, if you're close to some of the stuff that is going on, I think there is a huge amount that is already underway. And if you look at the whole value chain, over the last 18 months, I mean, I have fund managers who said in their entire investing career of 25 years, they had it was one fantastic quote. I think somebody had been asked, twice about ESG and sustainability in their entire career up until the start of this year, when there's now not a single meeting where it doesn't come up with clients. So when you think about what's going on in the chain, now that's institutional and wholesale clients. I thought it was really interesting, the conversation around pensions earlier, and particularly the default scheme, and the fact that people don't actually equate their pension with investing. So what we can do as an industry is we can be very active in the way that we keep engaging with companies. And if you, the change in the conversations over the last year and a half have been extraordinary. That is why you're seeing fossil fuel costs of capital now rise for projects, because it's getting harder, because people understand the sort of costs of doing it. So you're seeing that cost of capital adjustment start to happen. And I think that's really important. So I think those engagements are making a difference, but also going back and thinking in our workplace business, we're working really hard how we can make the default schemes much more sustainability focused, so that that decision can be taken for people. They don't have to make an active decision. And so there are different pieces along this chain. If there was one single bullet, Elizabeth, we would have fired it by now. We know that there's not. As asset managers, we need to look at each bit of the chain and just try and, again, it comes back to moving in the right direction. It's a complex chain. It's a complex web that we're all dealing with. But, I think being honest, and I think just going back to your very first question around time horizons, when companies want to be bold about doing something quite transformational, if you look at a company like Tesla, actually the market was quite a good, proved to be quite a good mechanism of allowing something really brave and bold and quite different to what, the way a Tesla car has been designed from the bottom up of battery technology, whatever. and the capital market was able to back that. So we know that capital markets are capable of doing that. So we need to make sure that as investors, we are open to the bold and willing to back the bold in a climate environment from companies that we don't necessarily associate with the brave and the bold, because they're companies we've known and they've been around for 50 years or 100 years, and they might be trying to do that transition from old world to new world. So I think there's no one thing, there's a bunch of different things, I think.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And I think you talked about the bold. Very often bold starts in small and medium-sized companies. And you know better than most, given your background, just how important the economic contribution from small and mid-sized enterprises is, whether they're social enterprises, sustainable, or just classic small enterprises. There's a couple of questions about capital flows to those enterprises. How can we get that better? And also the concern about the reporting load. How can we make reporting proportionate for smaller businesses that aren't going to have the luxury of the resources that a big business would have? So if you could combine those two thoughts into your answer.
So, gosh, yeah. So look, it's such a good question. One of the things that I am genuinely concerned about is actually, if you look at this year, large companies have had pretty good access to recapitalization. They've been able to do that pivot. We've been able, because of the central bank activity, we've been able to support for small and medium-sized businesses, particularly very small businesses. They've had to rely on loans, and debt is terrifying to small businesses because debt has to be paid back. So I'm actually concerned that we are creating a two-tier market in the business world, and I don't have an answer to that, but it is something that whenever anyone's willing to listen to me at a policy level, that I talk to about, and I'm concerned that we haven't cracked that one yet. Debt sorts liquidity, doesn't sort solvency, and we need to think about the solvency measure. So I think it is a very valid concern. In terms of on the reporting, I think making sure that we get a proportional, in the way that we have with accounting standards, actually, a degree of proportionality into what is reported and how it's reported, I think is important. And again, I think that's something that will come through as we try and rationalize and get to perhaps a more singular set of principles that can then be rolled out on a more consistent basis. One thing I would say though is for smaller and medium-sized businesses, typically their business models are simpler. They're typically operating in fewer companies, and they're typically operating over fewer business lines. So I actually think the reporting isn't as onerous as it is if you're a huge multinational. So I think there's already a degree of proportionality in there, but I think I take the point that there's less capacity to manage and deal with that. And therefore, as fund managers, we need to be measured about what we ask for as well.
And I think it's particularly true. It is proportionate, I think, as you say, on some of the financial reporting. There is even a regime for smaller companies. As we move into impact and outcome reporting, I think that's something we really need to bear in mind, that we don't somehow kill what we're trying to fund by asking for unreasonable and disproportionate demands. So I think that's really right. Now, there are some amazing questions in here, but you've been saved from the most difficult one that's got the most votes, not because I've avoided it, because it's just come to the top of the pile from Mark Wade about the role of central banks and the fact that we need more consistency. Mark, it's a great question, and I think we're going to save that one rather than try and answer it in 30 seconds, because that's all we've got left. But Anne, can I say a huge thank you on behalf of the Impacting Investing Institute? That was a fantastic chat. And thanks for your optimism and encouragement and support, and the commitment of the industry to be part of the solution, particularly as we go into next year. Thank you very much indeed.